Long ago, in the heart of East Asia, there was a small, beautiful country called Korea. It was a land of green mountains, flowing rivers, and proud people with deep traditions. For thousands of years, Korea had been one united nation. One language, one culture, one people. But the peace and unity of this land would not last forever. To understand how the Korean War began, we have to go back a little in time, to the early 1900s. In 1910, Korea was invaded and taken over by Japan. For the next 35 years, Korea was not free. The Japanese ruled harshly. They took control of Korean lands, businesses, schools, and even the way people lived. Many Koreans were forced to speak Japanese instead of their own language. Korean history and culture were hidden or destroyed. The people were not allowed to make their own government or decisions. Still, the Korean spirit never died. Secret groups met at night to plan protests. Teachers secretly taught Korean history. Farmers whispered about freedom. The people waited and hoped for the day when Korea could be free again. That day came at the end of World War II in 1945. When Japan surrendered after the atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, all the countries Japan had controlled, including Korea, were suddenly free. But freedom, in this case, came with confusion. Two powerful nations, the United States and the Soviet Union, had helped defeat Japan. Both wanted to make sure that Japan and its old territories didn't rise again. So they decided to divide Korea temporarily, just to keep things organized until a new, free government could be formed. They drew a line across the map of Korea, a simple line that would later change history forever. That line was called the 38th parallel. The north of this line would be controlled by the Soviet Union, and the south would be controlled by the United States. It was supposed to be temporary, maybe a few months, until elections could unite the country again. But as time went on, the world itself began to divide. After World War II, a new kind of tension began, not just in Korea, but all over the world. It was called the Cold War. The world was split between two big ideas. One side believed in communism, led by the Soviet Union. The other side believed in democracy and capitalism, led by the United States. Communism meant that the government controlled everything, the farms, the factories, and even what people could say. The idea was that everyone would be equal, but in reality, people had very little freedom. Democracy meant people could vote, own property, start businesses, and speak freely. But it also meant competition and inequality. These two systems were total opposites, and both sides wanted to spread their way of life to more countries. The Cold War wasn't a war of bombs. It was a war of ideas and influence and power. Because the North was supported by the Soviets, it became communist. Because the South was supported by the Americans, it became democratic. In 1948, two separate governments were formed. In the North, Kim Il-sung became the leader of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, North Korea. In the South, Syngman Rhee became the president of the Republic of Korea, South Korea. Now there were two Koreas, two flags, two governments, two armies. The people didn't like this. Families were divided. Brothers found themselves living in different countries. Villages split down the middle. And both sides claimed to be the real Korea. Kim Il-sung in the North wanted to unite the country under communism. Syngman Rhee in the South wanted to unite it under democracy. They both dreamed of one Korea, but under their own rule. And so, both sides began to prepare for something terrible: war. From 1948 to 1950, tension grew. Along the 38th parallel, both sides built up their armies. Soldiers stood guard day and night. Sometimes they exchanged angry shouts, sometimes even gunfire. The North trained its army with help from the Soviet Union and China. They were given tanks, planes, and artillery. The South, meanwhile, was trained and supplied by the United States. People living near the border were scared. They heard gunshots in the distance. Farmers worried that one day the soldiers would come marching through their fields. In Seoul, the capital of South Korea, people tried to live normal lives, going to school, selling goods in the market, building homes. But rumors of war were everywhere. Kim Il-sung was young, ambitious, and confident. He believed that the South could be conquered quickly. He told his Soviet allies that if he attacked, the South Korean people would rise up and help him. At first, the Soviet leader Joseph Stalin was careful. He didn't want to start a war that could anger the United States. But by 1950, Stalin's confidence grew. The Soviets had tested their first atomic bomb. China had also become communist after Mao Zedong's victory in 1949. Stalin finally agreed to support Kim's plan. Secretly. Together they built up North Korea's military. Over 150,000 soldiers, hundreds of tanks, dozens of aircraft, powerful artillery. By June 1950, Kim Il-sung was ready. He told his generals, "We will march south and reunify the country in a matter of days." Meanwhile, in South Korea, few people knew what was about to happen. The soldiers along the border were tired and under-equipped. Many had old rifles and no tanks at all. The U.S. had recently withdrawn most of its troops from Korea, thinking that the region was now safe. Syngman Rhee's government was struggling with protests, poverty, and political tension. People were focused on survival, not war. But early one morning, everything changed. It was Sunday, June 25, 1950. The sun had barely risen when the North Korean army, thousands of soldiers with tanks and artillery, crossed the 38th parallel and invaded South Korea. The attack was sudden and fierce. In villages near the border, people woke to the sound of explosions. Houses trembled as shells landed. Soldiers ran across fields, shouting commands. Within hours, Seoul, the capital of South Korea, was under threat. The South Korean army was unprepared. Many soldiers had no weapons to fight tanks. They retreated in panic. Roads filled with refugees, men, women, and children, carrying what little they could hold. The North Koreans moved fast. They captured towns one after another. Their tanks rolled across bridges, their soldiers waving red flags with the communist star. By the end of the summer of 1950, the North Koreans controlled most of the Korean peninsula. The South Korean army had retreated all the way to a small corner in the southeast, near the city of Busan, or Pusan. There, surrounded by sea and enemy forces, a final defense line was set up. It was called the Pusan Perimeter. The United Nations forces began arriving: American soldiers, British troops, and others from around the world. This was the beginning of a long, hard fight, one that would move up and down the Korean peninsula, through mountains, cities, rivers, and freezing winters. But before we go further, we must remember this. The Korean War didn't start simply because two armies wanted to fight. It began because the world itself was divided between freedom and control, democracy and communism, hope
and fear. And in the middle of that great divide stood Korea, a small nation caught in the storm of the Cold War.
The year was 1950, and the summer sun rose over the Korean peninsula like any other day. But this time, the air was filled not with birdsong or laughter, but with the echo of gunfire and the deep thunder of tanks. The peace that had lasted since the end of World War II was broken. The Korean War, one of the first great battles of the Cold War era, had begun. Early in the morning on June 25, 1950, the North Korean Army, trained and supplied by the Soviet Union, began a massive invasion. Across the 38th parallel, 135,000 soldiers, supported by 150 tanks, planes, and heavy artillery, charged southward. The South Korean soldiers guarding the border had no idea it was coming. Many were still asleep when shells began to fall on their camps. The loud boom of cannons shook the ground. Soldiers scrambled to put on their boots and grab their rifles, but most were outnumbered, outgunned, and unprepared. Within just 2 days, dozens of villages had fallen to the North Korean army. The North's troops, led by Kim Il-sung's generals, moved swiftly. They used tanks that rolled over the dirt roads, crushing fences and vehicles. They attacked bridges, railways, and telephone lines to cut off communication. The South Korean forces, called the Republic of Korea Army, or ROKA, tried to fight back bravely, but they had few weapons and no tanks. Many of their rifles were leftovers from World War II. Within days, they were pushed back towards Seoul, the capital city. On June 27th, just 2 days after the invasion began, the skies over Seoul were darkened by smoke. Buildings were burning. People screamed in the streets. Families rushed to escape. They carried children, old grandparents, and small bundles of clothes. Carts pulled by oxen filled the roads. Soldiers tried to direct them, shouting for people to move faster. By June 28th, the North Korean tanks had reached the outskirts of the city. The South Korean army had no way to stop them. As the North Koreans approached the Han River Bridge, the main way out of Seoul, South Korean engineers blew it up to slow the enemy down. But tragically, thousands of civilians were still on the bridge when it exploded. The blast killed many innocent people trying to flee. By evening, Seoul had fallen. The red flag of North Korea was raised over the city. For the people of South Korea, it was a moment of shock and despair. No one had expected the fall of their capital so quickly. After Seoul was captured, the South Korean army retreated southward, regrouping in smaller towns. But the North's army kept chasing them. Town after town fell. Suwon, Daejeon, and others. The roads became rivers of people. Soldiers mixed with refugees. Mothers carried crying babies on their backs. Farmers led cows, hoping to save them. Old men leaned on sticks as they walked for miles, barefoot and hungry. The summer heat made it worse. Many fainted from exhaustion. Diseases spread quickly among the refugees. It wasn't just a war between armies. It was a war that tore through every family, every village, every heart. When the news reached President Harry Truman in Washington, D.C., he knew this was a turning point. Just 5 years earlier, the world had ended one of the deadliest wars in history. People everywhere had said, never again. But now it looked like a new war was starting, one that could spread even further. Truman called his top generals and said, if we don't act now, we will have to act later, and it will cost us even more. So he ordered U.S. troops stationed in nearby Japan to go to Korea immediately. He also asked the United Nations to help defend South Korea. The UN Security Council voted and agreed. Soon soldiers from 16 countries joined the fight to help South Korea.
It was now not just Korea's war, it had become the war of the world's powers. To organize the international forces, the United Nations created a single command, led by General Douglas MacArthur, an experienced American general who had fought in World War II. MacArthur was based in Japan. When he heard the news, he immediately began planning how to stop the North Korean advance. He sent in planes to bomb supply lines and bridges. He ordered ships to carry weapons and soldiers across the sea to South Korea. Soon, American soldiers, wearing helmets marked UN, landed in Korea. They brought tanks, trucks, and supplies. For many young soldiers, it was their first time seeing Asia. They had never heard of Seoul or the 38th parallel, but now they were fighting and dying there. By August 1950, the North Koreans had captured almost the entire country. Only a small area in the southeast corner, around the port city of Pusan, now Busan, remained free. It was the last stronghold of South Korea and the United Nations. The defense line that surrounded it was called the Pusan Perimeter. If this line fell, the war would be lost. Day and night, soldiers worked to strengthen their positions. They dug trenches, built barricades, and prepared machine guns. North Korean tanks rolled toward the perimeter, firing shells into the hills. But this time, the defenders were ready. American planes flew overhead, dropping bombs on enemy tanks. Artillery thundered from behind the hills. The fighting was fierce. Mud, rain, and smoke filled the battlefield. At one point, it seemed the line would break, but the soldiers held on. A young American private later said, "We didn't sleep. We didn't eat much. We just fought and hoped the line wouldn't fall." For 6 long weeks, the Pusan perimeter became a symbol of courage. Thousands of soldiers from the U.S., South Korea, Britain, and other nations stood shoulder to shoulder. Finally, the North's advance was stopped. It was a turning point, but the war was far from over. While the soldiers defended Pusan, General MacArthur came up with a bold idea, one that could change everything. He planned to land troops far behind enemy lines, in a place called Inchon, near Seoul. If the landing succeeded, the North Korean army, stretched thin across South Korea, would be trapped between two forces. But the plan was risky. Inchon had huge tides. The water level could rise and fall more than 30 feet. If the ships got stuck in the mud, the soldiers could be stranded. Many of MacArthur's advisors warned him not to do it, but MacArthur was confident. He said, "The very impossibility of the landing will make it succeed." In the early morning of September 15th, under dark clouds and strong winds, hundreds of ships approached Inchon. As the tide came in, 17,000 UN troops, mostly American and South Korean, stormed the beaches. They climbed ladders, dodged bullets, and fought through narrow streets. Within hours, they captured Inchon's harbor. Soon after, they marched toward Seoul. The North Korean army, shocked and surrounded, began to retreat. Just 2 weeks later, on September 28th, Seoul was liberated. Crowds cheered in the streets as UN soldiers entered the city. Women threw flowers, men waved flags, tears ran down faces that had seen too much loss. For the first time since June, hope returned to the South. With the North Koreans retreating, General MacArthur decided not to stop at the 38th parallel. He wanted to unite all Korea under one government, the South's. In October 1950, UN forces crossed into North Korea. The people in some northern villages welcomed them, thinking the war was finally over. But in truth, the most dangerous part of the war was yet to come. As the soldiers pushed toward the Yalu River, which marked the border with China, another powerful country was watching carefully and preparing to act. While armies marched and nations debated, ordinary Koreans were struggling to survive. Cities like Seoul, Daejeon, and Pyongyang were reduced to rubble. Bridges were gone, railways destroyed. Farmers couldn't plant their crops. Children searched through ruins for food. Mothers waited for sons who never returned. Refugee camps were set up across the South. Tents lined muddy fields. People shared rice, water, and stories of escape. Many children had no parents left. Some joined soldiers to cook or carry supplies. Others wandered from village to village begging for food. Even in this darkness, there were moments of kindness. A soldier sharing his bread with a hungry boy. A nurse staying up all night to comfort the wounded. A stranger helping an old woman cross a flooded road. The war showed the worst of humanity, but also, sometimes, the best. By late 1950, the tide of war had turned again, this time in favor of the South and the UN. The North Korean army was collapsing. Many soldiers surrendered or ran into the mountains. In Washington and Seoul, leaders spoke of victory. But far to the north, across the Yalu River, China's leader Mao Zedong watched with growing concern. He feared that if UN forces reached China's border, they might not stop there. And so, in secret, he began sending soldiers, hundreds of thousands, into North Korea. They moved only at night, hiding during the day. Their uniforms had no markings. Their mission was clear: drive the UN forces out of North Korea. The next chapter of the war, the entry of China, would turn the Korean War into one of the most brutal and uncertain conflicts of the 20th century. The autumn of 1950 brought hope to the people of South Korea. The invading army from the north had been pushed back. Seoul was free again, and the blue and red South Korean flag flew proudly above the city. People began to whisper that maybe, just maybe, the war would end soon. But history had another plan. The Korean War was about to become much bigger, no longer just a fight between North and South, but a war involving nations from around the world. After the Inchon Landing, General Douglas MacArthur became a hero. His bold strategy had turned the war around. Now, instead of defending the last corner of Korea, UN forces were advancing northward, chasing the retreating North Korean army. By October 1950, they had crossed the 38th parallel, the very line that had divided Korea. MacArthur's goal was clear: unite Korea under a free, democratic government. The United Nations gave him permission to continue, but with one warning: he must stop if the Chinese entered the war. At that time, China was a new communist country, led by Mao Zedong. MacArthur didn't believe China would actually get involved. He thought their army was too weak after years of civil war, but he was wrong. At the very top of the Korean peninsula flows a long, cold river, the Yalu River. On one side was North Korea, and on the other was China. As UN forces moved closer to the Yalu, China grew nervous. They worried that if the Americans and their allies reached the river, they might cross into Chinese territory next. So in secret, Mao made a decision. He ordered his soldiers, called the Chinese People's Volunteer Army, to cross the river at night. They wore padded winter coats. They carried few supplies. They marched silently through the mountains, hidden by darkness. Even their campfires were covered so airplanes wouldn't see them. By late October, hundreds of thousands of Chinese soldiers were inside North Korea, waiting for the right moment to strike. The UN troops didn't know the Chinese were there. They thought victory was close. As they marched north, soldiers joked that they would be home by Christmas. But in the cold mountain valleys of northern Korea, strange signs began to appear. Footprints in the snow, echoes of horns in the distance, villagers whispering, "The Chinese are coming." At first, no one believed it. Then one freezing night near the Chongchon River, the hills suddenly lit up with gunfire. Thousands of Chinese soldiers poured down from the mountains, shouting battle cries and blowing horns. They surrounded the UN troops from all sides. The surprise was total. The Chinese attack was fierce and well coordinated. They didn't have tanks or heavy weapons like the Americans, but they had numbers and speed. They attacked at night, using the darkness to their advantage. Many UN soldiers were trapped and had to fight their way out through snow and ice. The cold was unbearable. Temperatures dropped to minus 30 degrees Celsius. One soldier later said, "The cold was our biggest enemy.
Our guns jammed, our food froze, and even our words turned to ice. By the end of November, the UN army was retreating south. The dream of uniting Korea had vanished. One of the most famous and tragic battles of the war took place near the Chosin Reservoir in North Korea. There, around 30,000 UN troops, mostly U.S. Marines, were surrounded by 120,000 Chinese soldiers. The temperature was so low that fuel froze in tanks. Medical supplies turned solid. Soldiers had to peel their skin off their rifles because the metal was so cold. But the Marines refused to give up. They fought day and night, breaking through enemy lines while carrying their wounded and fallen comrades with them. When asked if they were retreating, one Marine famously said, "Retreat, hell, we're just attacking in another direction." After 2 weeks of brutal fighting, the Marines reached the sea at Hungnam, where ships were waiting to take them to safety. Although the battle was costly, their courage became legendary. The Chosin Few, as they were later called, became a symbol of bravery and survival. By December 1950, UN forces had to abandon most of North Korea. Pyongyang, the capital of the North, fell again, this time back to communist hands. As the army withdrew southward, thousands of civilians followed them behind, afraid of what might happen if they stayed behind. The roads were packed with refugees, soldiers, and vehicles. Snow fell thick on the ground. Children cried from hunger. Many froze to death along the way. It was a heartbreaking sight, a river of people moving south, hoping to find safety. The Chinese advance was unstoppable. In January 1951, they crossed the 38th parallel. Once again, the city of Seoul fell. For the second time in less than a year, the capital was under enemy control. People who had just rebuilt their homes now had to flee again. The sound of bombs echoed through the valleys. Even UN leaders were shocked. General MacArthur admitted, "We face an entirely new war now." The sudden entry of China into the war changed everything. It was no longer a simple North versus South conflict, but a war involving nations from around the world. On one side stood communism, represented by North Korea, China, and the Soviet Union. On the other side stood democracy, represented by South Korea, the United States, and the United Nations. Newspapers around the world printed headlines like, "China enters the war," "UN forces in retreat," "Is World War III coming?" People feared that the Korean War might grow into another world war, especially since both the US and the Soviet Union now had atomic bombs. As the situation worsened, a disagreement began between President Truman and General MacArthur. MacArthur wanted to expand the war. He believed the U.S. should bomb Chinese bases and even use nuclear weapons if necessary. He said, "There is no substitute for victory." But Truman wanted to avoid another world war. He believed the goal should be to protect South Korea, not to destroy China. The two men clashed bitterly. In April 1951, Truman made a historic decision. He fired General MacArthur from his command. Many Americans were shocked. MacArthur was a hero to millions. But Truman stood firm, saying, "I fired him because he would not respect the authority of the president. I didn't fire him because he was a bad general. I fired him because he was wrong." MacArthur returned home to a hero's welcome, but the war continued without him. After MacArthur's dismissal, General Matthew Ridgway took command of UN forces. Ridgway was calm, disciplined, and strategic. He wore a grenade on his vest as a symbol of determination. Under his leadership, UN forces regrouped and launched counterattacks. By March 1951, they recaptured Seoul for the fourth time since the war began. The fighting now settled near the 38th parallel once again, almost exactly where it had started 9 months earlier. The war had destroyed cities, cost thousands of lives, and yet both sides were back to where they began. While generals fought and borders shifted, ordinary life in Korea was full of struggle. In the south, food was scarce. People lined up for hours for rice or water. Schools were destroyed and children learned in tents. Hospitals overflowed with wounded soldiers and civilians. Doctors worked with little medicine. Nurses treated patients by candlelight. In the north, life was even harder. Villages were bombed and fields were burned. People hid in caves to escape the air raids. Yet through all this suffering, the Korean people remained strong. They helped one another, rebuilt what they could, and prayed for peace. By mid-1951, neither side could win. The front line moved only a few miles in either direction. Mountains, rivers, and trenches became deadly battlefields, fought over again and again. Soldiers lived in freezing bunkers and muddy trenches. The war had turned into a stalemate, a fight that no one could truly win. But the world had learned something important. This was no longer just a local war. It was a symbol of the entire Cold War, a struggle between two ideologies played out on one small peninsula. By the end of the first year, the numbers were staggering. Over 1 million soldiers had been killed, wounded, or captured. Millions of civilians had lost their homes. Entire cities were gone. And yet, the fighting continued. For the soldiers on both sides, it was no longer about politics or ideology. It was about survival, about staying alive one more day. Every night, as the sounds of war echoed across the hills, people in both the north and south looked up at the same sky and prayed for peace. Some prayed for their sons on the front lines. Some prayed for food or safety. Others simply prayed to see their families again. But the war wasn't ready to end yet. The next 2 years would bring endless talks, shifting lines, and countless sacrifices before peace would even be discussed. The winter of 1951 in Korea was bitterly cold. Snow covered the mountains like white blankets, and rivers froze so thick that even tanks could cross over them. But the war did not stop. Soldiers on both sides, from North Korea, South Korea, China, the United States, and many other countries, kept fighting in the freezing wind. By now, the Korean War had changed. It was no longer about who could capture the most cities. It had become a war of endurance, a slow, painful struggle to survive in some of the harshest conditions on Earth. After the UN forces recaptured Seoul in early 1951, the front line stabilized again near the 38th parallel, the same line where the war had started. But both sides did not want to stop fighting. They believed that if they could win just one more big battle, maybe the war would finally end in their favor. So both armies dug deep into the rocky hills. They built trenches, tunnels, and bunkers out of frozen earth and stone. From these positions, they fired at each other day and night. The mountains echoed with the constant sound of gunfire and explosions. The hills got names like Heartbreak Ridge, Bloody Ridge, and Pork Chop Hill, names that showed how much suffering happened there. A soldier later said, "We didn't fight for cities or rivers anymore. We fought for hills, and even those were covered in ice and blood." For the soldiers, life on the front was almost unbearable. The winters were freezing, and the summers were wet and hot. In winter, frostbite turned fingers and toes black. In summer, heavy rains turned trenches into rivers of mud. Rats scurried over sleeping soldiers at night. Food was scarce and often frozen solid. Sometimes soldiers melted snow just to have water to drink. They lived in small dugouts lined with wood and sandbags. At night, they wrapped themselves in blankets, trying to stay warm while the wind howled outside. Many soldiers wrote letters home, to mothers, wives, or sweethearts, but those letters often took weeks or months to arrive. Still, those words gave them strength.
to keep going. One letter from a young American soldier said, "Mom, it's so cold here that even the stars seem frozen. But don't worry, I'm fighting for something good, for peace." While the soldiers battled in the mountains, a new kind of war was being fought in the sky. Jet airplanes, the newest technology of the time, zoomed above the clouds in dogfights. The United States Air Force used planes called F-86 Sabres, while the Soviet Union secretly sent pilots flying MiG-15 jets to help North Korea. Although the Soviet pilots pretended to be Chinese or Korean, many knew the truth. This was really a test between two superpowers. The air battles were fast and deadly. Pilots flew at speeds never seen before, sometimes faster than sound. They twisted and turned through the air like silver arrows, trying to outmaneuver each other. The area where these battles took place was nicknamed MiG Alley. There, hundreds of planes were shot down. It was the first major jet war in history. Down below, Korean villagers watched the streaks of light and smoke in the sky, not realizing they were witnessing a new kind of warfare, one that would shape the future of aviation. Even as the war dragged on, the United Nations continued to send support. By now, soldiers from 21 different countries were fighting together under the UN flag. They came from nations big and small: the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Turkey, Australia, France, Greece, Ethiopia, Colombia, and more. Each brought something unique. The Turkish soldiers were known for their courage in hand-to-hand combat. The Ethiopians were famous for their discipline and quiet strength. The British and Canadians provided steady firepower on the front lines. For many, this was the first time soldiers from so many different countries fought together for one common goal: to defend peace. They didn't speak the same language, but they shared food, laughter, and stories. A Korean child once asked a UN soldier, "Why did you come to help us?" The soldier smiled and replied, "Because peace has no borders." By mid-1951, both sides realized something important. Neither could truly win. Every time one side captured a hill or a valley, they would lose it again days later. Thousands of lives were being lost for just a few miles of land. The war had turned into a stalemate, a situation where no one could move forward. Still, neither side wanted to admit defeat. The leaders in the North and the South both wanted to appear strong, and behind them the great powers, the United States, the Soviet Union, and China, each wanted to show that their system of government was stronger. So the fighting continued, not to win, but to avoid losing. Finally, in July 1951, representatives from both sides agreed to meet to talk about peace. They gathered in a small village called Chosin, near the front line. The goal was to find a way to stop the fighting and draw a new border between North and South Korea. But even talking about peace was difficult. The two sides argued for weeks about small things, like where the meeting should take place, how the table should be arranged, and what flag should be displayed. Eventually, the peace talks moved to another village called Panmunjom, which would later become famous as the main meeting place between North and South Korea. Still, the talks dragged on and on. Every time they came close to an agreement, new battles would start again.
The soldiers joked, "They talk peace during the day, and we fight at night." One of the biggest issues that kept the talks going for months was about prisoners of war, POWs, soldiers captured by the enemy. There were thousands of POWs on both sides. The North wanted all of theirs back, but many captured soldiers didn't want to return to communist countries. They were afraid of punishment or didn't believe in that system anymore. The UN insisted that every prisoner should be free to choose where they wanted to live. This disagreement continued for more than a year. While politicians debated in Panmunjom, soldiers kept dying in the mountains.
Behind the front lines, life for civilians was harsh but full of courage. Korean families who had lost everything began rebuilding their homes using wood, tin, and even pieces of old tanks. Children went back to school in bombed-out classrooms. Teachers used bits of charcoal to write on broken blackboards. Women worked as nurses and cooks for soldiers. Farmers returned to their fields, planting crops between craters left by bombs. The war had taken away much, but it could not take away the human spirit. A South Korean farmer once said, "We have no roofs, no walls, but we still have hands, and as long as we have hands, we will build again." From 1951 to 1953, the front lines barely moved. Battles like Heartbreak Ridge, White Horse Hill, and Triangle Hill became endless cycles of attack and counterattack. Each side fought for control of small pieces of land, sometimes only a few hundred meters wide. Thousands of soldiers died for those hills, which were often lost again within days. The soldiers' lives became a routine of mud, fear, and exhaustion. They fought during the day, repaired bunkers at night, and wrote letters in between. They saw friends fall beside them and wondered when it would be their turn. The war had stopped feeling like a cause, it had become survival. The winter of 1952 was one of the coldest on record. Blizzards swept through the hills. Tents collapsed under snow. Fires barely kept the frost away. In some areas, soldiers froze to death in their sleep. In others, they fought in blinding snowstorms where they couldn't even see the enemy. One Korean boy who lived near the front later said, "The snow was red that winter. Red from the blood that fell on it." By now, the air war had become constant. UN bombers attacked factories, railways, and bridges in the north to cut off supplies. In return, Chinese and Soviet pilots fought fiercely to defend them. The skies over Korea were filled with trails of white smoke and flashes of light. It was a war fought on land, in the air, and even at sea, where U.S. and British ships fired shells from the coast. Despite all the suffering, the peace talks in Panmunjom slowly began to make progress. Both sides were exhausted, their soldiers tired, their countries bleeding. By early 1953, they finally agreed on most points. The border would stay roughly at the 38th parallel. A demilitarized zone would be created, a narrow strip of land between North and South where no soldiers could fight. Prisoners of war would be allowed to choose whether to return home or stay in the South. But before the final agreement could be signed, tragedy struck. In March 1953, Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union, died. His death changed the balance of power. The new Soviet leaders wanted to end the war quickly. They pushed China and North Korea to reach a peace deal. At the same time, in the South, President Syngman Rhee was angry. He wanted to keep fighting until Korea was fully united. But most of the world wanted peace. Even his closest allies told him to stop. And so, the war entered its final stage. Tired armies, frozen hills, and endless talks that finally began to lead toward peace.
The year was 1953, and the war in Korea had been going on for nearly 3 long years. What began as a sudden invasion had turned into an endless cycle of battles, peace talks, and heartbreak. Millions of lives had been lost. Entire cities had been destroyed. And yet, the line between North and South Korea was almost the same as when the war began. The soldiers were tired. The people were tired. Even the leaders were tired. Everyone wanted peace, but peace was not easy to find. By now, the war had become a stalemate, a deadlock where neither side could win or lose completely. The front line barely moved. It zigzagged across mountains and valleys, stretching from the east coast to the west coast, filled with trenches and barbed wire. Both armies faced each other every day, often just a few hundred meters apart. Sometimes they shouted across the hills. Sometimes they exchanged gunfire. But mostly, they waited through cold nights, hot days, and endless uncertainty. The fighting continued, even while the diplomats met at Panmunjom to talk about peace. The life of a soldier in 1953 was hard and lonely. They lived in muddy trenches, surrounded by sandbags and barbed wire. They slept in dugouts, their helmets always close by. In winter, The freezing wind cut through their coats. In summer, the rain turned everything into sticky mud. Sometimes, the smell of gunpowder mixed with wet earth never went away. They were constantly alert. Every noise could mean danger. Snipers watched from the hills. Mines were buried underfoot. Every step, every movement could be the last. Yet soldiers still wrote letters, sang songs, and dreamed of home. Some carved names into their rifles. Some shared stories from before the war about school, family, and love. For many young men, the war had stolen their youth. A soldier once wrote in his diary, "We fight for hills, but we also fight for hope. The hope that one day this land will see peace again." While men fought on the front lines, women carried their own battles behind the scenes. In South Korea, thousands of women became nurses, volunteers, and teachers in refugee camps. They took care of the wounded, fed orphans, and rebuilt homes. Foreign nurses from countries like the US, Britain, and Australia also served in field hospitals. They worked long hours, treating soldiers with frostbite, bullet wounds, and exhaustion. One nurse described the experience, "We couldn't save everyone, but every life we saved gave us strength to keep going." There were also women in the north, working in factories or farming fields, helping their country survive under heavy bombing. Even in destruction, women's courage and care became a quiet light in the darkest times. As the ground war slowed down, the air war grew heavier. The United Nations, especially the United States Air Force, began to bomb the north more aggressively. Their goal was to destroy railways, bridges, factories, and supply routes. Cities like Pyongyang, Wonsan, and Sinwiju were reduced to rubble. Entire towns disappeared under waves of bombs. For people living in the north, life became a struggle for survival. Families built underground shelters. Children grew up hearing the constant whine of planes overhead. An old man from Pyongyang later said, "We stopped counting the bombs. We just prayed that one day the sky would go quiet again." The destruction was enormous, and it showed how modern warfare could reach every corner of life. In March 1953, the world changed. Joseph Stalin, the powerful leader of the Soviet Union, suddenly died. His death sent shockwaves through the communist world. The new Soviet leaders did not want to keep spending money and resources on a war that seemed endless. They began to pressure China and North Korea to reach a peace deal quickly. At the same time, Dwight Eisenhower became the new president of the United States. Eisenhower had been a famous general during World War II, and he too wanted the war to end, but only if it ended honorably. He promised to visit Korea himself, and he did, flying secretly to the battlefront in December 1952. He met with soldiers, walked through muddy trenches, and saw with his own eyes the human cost of the war. After returning to Washington, Eisenhower said, "We cannot allow this conflict to drag on forever. The time has come to bring it to a close." By spring 1953, both sides began to soften their positions in the peace talks. The issue of prisoners of war, which had been the biggest obstacle, finally started to move forward. They agreed that captured soldiers would be allowed to choose whether to go home or stay in the South. Special neutral nations like Sweden, India, and Switzerland were asked to help supervise this process. At the same time, the world was changing. The Cold War was spreading into new regions. The US and the Soviet Union were competing for influence in Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. Both superpowers realized they had more to lose if the Korean War continued. So slowly, the diplomatic wheels began to turn faster.
Even as peace seemed near, the battles did not stop. Both sides wanted to control as much territory as possible before the ceasefire was signed. The hills of central Korea turned red again with fighting, especially in places like Old Baldy, Porkchop Hill, and Outpost Harry. These battles were small compared to the huge invasions of 1950, but they were just as deadly. Sometimes a single hill changed hands 5 or 6 times. Soldiers climbed slopes under artillery fire, only to be pushed back again hours later. The irony was painful. Men were dying for land that would soon be given up when the ceasefire took effect. A British officer later said, "We fought to the last bullet. But when the peace came, the map hardly changed. It was a war of movement that ended where it started." Finally, after more than 2 years of negotiation, the peace talks succeeded. On July 27, 1953, the representatives of the United Nations, North Korea, and China signed the Korean Armistice Agreement at Panmunjom. The agreement didn't mean total peace. It was a ceasefire, not a peace treaty. The war was stopped, but not officially ended. The main points of the agreement were: a ceasefire line would be drawn near the 38th parallel, the same line that had divided North and South Korea before the war. A demilitarized zone, DMZ, 4 kilometers wide, would be created along the border. No soldiers or weapons would be allowed inside it. Both sides would return prisoners of war, allowing them to choose where they wanted to go. A military armistice commission would be set up to ensure both sides followed the rules.
At 10 a.m. on July 27, the guns finally fell silent. The war that had burned for 3 years came to a stop. When the ceasefire took effect, soldiers on both sides looked across the battlefield in disbelief. After so many months of gunfire, the silence felt unreal. Birds began to sing again. Smoke slowly lifted from the hills. And for the first time in years, there was peace, even if it was fragile. Some soldiers cried. Others simply sat down, too exhausted to react. They had survived, but many of their friends had not. Across Korea, families began searching for loved ones. Refugees tried to return to their villages, but many found only ruins. The land was scarred, but people began to rebuild. They planted rice again, fixed bridges, and reopened schools. Hope, though weak, began to rise. The Korean War was one of the most destructive conflicts of the 20th century. By the time it ended, around 3 million Koreans, soldiers and civilians, had died. About 37,000 American soldiers were killed, along with thousands from other UN nations. Nearly 1 million Chinese and North Korean soldiers also lost their lives. Entire families were separated by the new border, many never to see each other again. Even today, some brothers and sisters remain divided by that invisible line called the DMZ. The war left deep wounds, not just on the land, but in hearts and memories. After the armistice, North Korea and South Korea became 2 very different nations. North Korea, under Kim Il-sung, became a strict communist state with close ties to China and the Soviet Union. The government controlled everything, and people had very little freedom. South Korea, led by Syngman Rhee, remained under democracy, though its early years were difficult. The economy was weak, cities were destroyed, and millions of people were homeless. The 2 sides remained hostile. The DMZ became one of the most heavily guarded borders in the world, lined with mines, fences, and watchtowers. Even though the fighting had stopped, the war never truly ended. When soldiers from other countries began returning home, many were greeted as heroes, but their hearts were heavy.
They had seen things that words could never describe. A Canadian soldier said, "We came to help a country we didn't know, and we left a part of our hearts there." In South Korea, people thanked the foreign soldiers for their sacrifice. In some villages, children waved flags as troops marched away. But even as the world moved on, the memories of the Korean War remained etched in every soldier's soul. When people asked, "Who won the Korean War?" there was no simple answer. Neither side had achieved their original goals. The border was the same. Both countries were devastated. But the war had shown something important. The world was no longer divided by geography. It was divided by ideology, by how people believed societies should be run. The Korean War became the first major conflict of the Cold War, a sign to the tensions that would shape the world for decades to come.
When the guns finally fell silent on July 27, 1953, a deep stillness covered the Korean peninsula. The war had ended, but the wounds it left behind ran deep. Cities were in ruins. Families were torn apart. Fields that once grew rice were now filled with craters. And though the killing had stopped, peace had not truly arrived. The Korean War was over, but its shadow still stretched across the land and across time. The DMZ, Demilitarized Zone, became the most visible reminder of the war's ending. Stretching roughly 250 kilometers, or 155 miles, across the center of the Korean peninsula, it marked the line where the fighting stopped. It was called demilitarized, but in truth, it became one of the most heavily militarized borders in the world. Barbed wire fences stretched for miles. Landmines were buried deep in the soil. Watchtowers and guard posts dotted the hills. On one side stood North Korea under the communist leadership of Kim Il-sung. On the other stood South Korea, led by Syngman Rhee and supported by the United States and the United Nations. The two Koreas faced each other. The same people, the same language, the same history, but now living in two very different worlds. Families who had been separated by the war could not cross to see one another. Letters couldn't be sent. Phone calls didn't exist. A mother in the South could not even know if her son in the North was alive. To this day, the DMZ remains a painful scar, a reminder of how one nation became two. After the ceasefire, South Korea looked like a broken country. More than 80% of its buildings had been damaged or destroyed. Bridges, railroads, and factories lay in rubble. Millions of people were homeless. But the South Korean people did not give up. With help from the United States and the United Nations, they began to rebuild, brick by brick, home by home. At first, life was difficult. There were food shortages and poverty everywhere. Children went to school under tents or in open fields. Farmers plowed their fields with oxen and wooden tools. But the people had hope. They believed that if they worked hard, their children would see a better Korea. By the 1960s and 1970s, South Korea slowly began to rise. Factories were built, roads were repaired, and new schools opened. Foreign aid helped, but it was the determination of the Korean people that truly rebuilt the nation. South Korea turned itself from a war-torn land into a growing economy, a story of survival, hard work, and perseverance. In the North, Kim Il-sung promised his people a different kind of recovery. With the help of the Soviet Union and China, North Korea began to rebuild under a strict communist system. The government took control of all farms, factories, and businesses. People were told to work for the country, not for themselves. Schools and propaganda promoted loyalty to Kim Il-sung, who was called the Great Leader. At first, North Korea's economy grew faster than the South's. Factories were rebuilt quickly, and electricity spread across the country. But over time, life became more difficult.
freedom disappeared, and the government tightly controlled what people could say, read, or believe. While South Korea opened its doors to the world, North Korea closed itself off. Two very different societies grew side by side, one democratic and open, the other isolated and controlled. Perhaps the greatest tragedy of the Korean War was the division of families. When the 38th parallel became the border, millions of people found themselves trapped on opposite sides. Parents and children, brothers and sisters, husbands and wives, all separated by a line they could not cross. For decades, they lived without knowing what had happened to their loved ones. Many died waiting for news that never came. In later years, both governments organized small reunion programs where a limited number of families could meet at the DMZ for a few hours. The scenes were emotional beyond words. Elderly mothers hugged sons they hadn't seen in 50 years. Siblings cried together, knowing this might be their first and last meeting. One old woman said through her tears, "I used to dream of hearing my brother's voice. Now I have, and my heart can finally rest." But for most families, such reunions never happened. The separation of loved ones remains one of the deepest scars left by the war. Although the Korean War was one of the deadliest conflicts of the 20th century, it is often called the Forgotten War. This is because it happened so soon after World War II and before the long, dramatic years of the Vietnam War. Many people outside Asia stopped paying attention once the ceasefire was signed. But for Koreans, it could never be forgotten. It shaped their lives, their politics, and their future. For the soldiers who fought there, the war left invisible wounds. Many carried memories of fear, frostbite, and loss. They returned home changed, some with medals, others with silence. One American veteran later said, "We came home, but part of us stayed there, in the cold hills of Korea." And for Koreans themselves, every rebuilt road and every standing home was a reminder of the price of peace. The Korean War did not bring global peace. Instead, it marked the beginning of a new kind of tension, the Cold War, a global rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union. For the next 40 years, the two superpowers would face off through threats, weapons, and smaller wars in places like Vietnam, Cuba, and Afghanistan. Korea had been the first major battlefield of this new world, a test of strength between two ideologies, communism and democracy. And though the shooting stopped in 1953, the political conflict never truly did. Even today, North and South Korea remain technically at war because a peace treaty was never signed, only a truce.
As the decades passed, the two Koreas continued to grow apart. South Korea became one of the world's most advanced and free nations. Its cities, Seoul, Busan, Inchon, became centers of technology, business, and culture. It produced global brands, K-pop music, and movies known across the world. Meanwhile, North Korea became one of the most secretive countries on Earth. After Kim Il-sung's death, his son, Kim Jong-il, and later his grandson, Kim Jong-un, continued to rule with absolute power. The country built weapons instead of industries, and its people lived under strict control and isolation. The border between North and South became a symbol of the world's divisions. One half of the peninsula bright with lights, the other half dark and silent at night. Yet even with all their differences, both sides still speak the same language and share the same ancestors. Deep down, many Koreans on both sides still dream of unity. One nation, one people, one home. More than 1.8 million soldiers from 21 different countries served under the United Nations command in Korea. Many never returned home. Their graves are scattered across Korean soil, in cemeteries where flags from many nations wave together. In the city of Busan, the United Nations Memorial Cemetery stands as a place of honor.
There, visitors can see rows of white stones with names from all over the world: Canada, Turkey, Australia, the United States, Colombia, and more. Every year, Korean families bring flowers to those graves, even for soldiers they never met. They bow in respect, whispering, "Thank you for our freedom." South Koreans have never forgotten the sacrifice made by the world to defend their land. Their gratitude lives on in the peaceful cities and thriving communities that grew from the ashes of war. The Korean War taught the world several important lessons. War leaves no true winners. Both sides lost countless lives and destroyed their own land. Peace must be built, not forced. Lasting peace comes only when nations talk, understand, and compromise, not when they fight. Freedom and unity are priceless. The Korean people learned that freedom has a cost, and unity, once lost, is hard to regain. Even decades later, the war's message remains clear. Violence divides, but hope rebuilds. Since the 1990s, there have been moments of hope and heartbreak as both Koreas have tried to improve relations. Leaders have met across the DMZ, shaking hands and promising peace. Families have been briefly reunited. Joint economic projects have begun, and sometimes failed. But every effort, no matter how small, shows that the desire for peace still lives on. In 2018, the leaders of North and South Korea met again at the border, stepping briefly across the line that divided their nations. They smiled and promised a future of cooperation. It was a moment of hope, proof that even after 70 years, peace is still possible. The Korean War changed the course of world history. It showed that the Cold War was not just about words. It could turn deadly. It led to the strengthening of the United Nations and the formation of powerful alliances like NATO. It also made countries realize the danger of nuclear weapons and the importance of diplomacy. For Korea itself, the war created two nations that continued to define the region, one symbolizing freedom and democracy, the other isolation and control. Yet, despite their differences, both are part of the same ancient heritage, the same people who once lived together under the same flag. Today, when travelers visit the DMZ, they can stand on a platform and look across the border, at a land so close, yet so far away. They see soldiers on both sides, standing in silence. Beyond them, the hills are green again, birds fly freely, and rivers flow as they always have. Nature has healed, but hearts still wait for the same healing. The Korean War may have ended in 1953, but its story continues, in the dreams of families still divided, in the hope of peace, and in the lessons the world carries forward. Because war does not truly end when the fighting stops. It ends when understanding begins. So when we look back on the Korean War, we must remember it not just as a war of tanks and soldiers, but as a story of human endurance, hope, and the longing for unity. It reminds us how fragile peace can be, and how precious it truly is. Even now, more than 70 years later, the people of Korea, North and South, still wait for the day when the border fades and the word Korean once again means one nation, one family, one heart.